Çok değerli konuklarımız, sanatseverler, sizinle bugün çok önemli bir deneyimi paylaşacağız. Değerli misafirlerimiz var ve onların çağdaş sanatla ilgili, hepsi önemli de müzelerin, az sonra hepsini takdim edeceğim size. Ve bu deneyimi de bizimle paylaşmış gelmenizden son derece mutluyuz. Hoş geldiniz. Türkiye'de bildiğiniz gibi çağdaş sanat giderek önem kazanan bir platform. Pek çok galeri açılıyor, pek çok genç sanatçımız var ve hepsi büyük uluslararası alanlarda da isim yapmaya başlamış. Sanat kritiklerimiz var. Bütün bunların arasında dünyada da gelişen bir trend bu zaten. Türkiye bunu biraz geç yakaladı ama yakaladı. Dünyadaki müze ziyaretçilerinin yaşının giderek yukarıya doğru çıktığını, genç kesimleri cezbetmek için başka şeyler yapılması, başka programlara da yer verilmesi hep insanların kafasını yordu şimdiye kadar. Çağdaş sanatı bir şans gibi gören çevreler de var bunun için ve çağdaş sanatı bazen çok önemli sanat da müzelerinde onların dünyaca tanınan koleksiyonlarıyla yan yana görmek yadırgattı ilk başlarda ama bu giderek bir yaygınlık da kazanmadı değil. Şimdi biz bugün bunu tartışacağız. Biz Sabancı'da Müzesi biliyorsunuz çağdaş sanata ancak İstanbul Bienali çerçevesinde yer verdik şimdiye kadar. Bunun da önemli bir katkı olduğunu düşündük ve sadece genç sanatçıların lanse edildiği, birbirinden çok farklı kültürlerden gelen sanatçıların bir slogan, o yılın sloganı altında eser üretmesinin yanı sıra biraz geriye de bakmanın, bu alanın büyük ustalarını da getirmenin bizim görevimiz olduğunu düşündük. Ve zaten bu trendde de bir yer aldık zannediyorum. Birinci sergimiz dünyaca ünlü Deutsche Bank'ın koleksiyonlarından geldi. İkinci sergi 2 yıl sonra Joseph Beuys, çağdaş sanatın büyük öncüsü Joseph Beuys ve öğrencilerine hasredilmişti. Tamamen orijinal eserlerle ilk kez Türk seyircisi, sanatseveri karşılaştı. Daha sonraki sergimiz ise daha da ilginç oldu. Büyük Fransız sanatçısı Sophie Calle sadece bizim için, Türkiye ve İstanbul için bir eser üretti ve onu sergiledik burada. Şimdi bugün ise bildiğiniz gibi büyük bir uluslararası dünya sanatçısını ağırlıyoruz, Anish Kapoor. Bu serginin bir vesile olduğunu düşündük ki bu soruları soralım ve hepsi dünyaca ünlü isme sahip uzmanlara, konunun uzmanlarına soralım deneyimlerini, ne gördüler, ne yaşadılar, buna karşı duruşları nasıl, mesafeli mi, coşkuyla karşılıyorlar mı bunu, bir şans olarak mı görüyorlar, bütün bunları dinleyeceğiz. Katılımcılarımıza gelince bu işin öncüsü olan kişiden başlayayım izin verirseniz. Sir Norman Rosenthal, Londra Royal Akademi'nin uzun yıllar sanat direktörlüğünü 30 yıl boyunca yapmış ve çağdaş sanata her şeyden önce, herkesten önce yol vermiş bir kişi. Önünü açmış bir kişi. Pek çok bugünün büyük sanatçıları da onun sayesinde dünya platformunda yer aldılar dersek yanlış olmaz. Sir Norman bu serginin küratörüydü. Anish Kapoor sergisinin. Onun dışında bir başka büyük dostumuz vardı, müzeci. Profesör Claus-Peter Haase, Berlin'in İslam Sanatı Müzesi direktörü ama çağdaş sanata her zaman yakın olmuş, ona yer açmış bir kişi. Dr. Thomas Lenz, Harvard Üniversitesi Harvard Sanat Müzeleri direktörü ve onun hem kendi koleksiyonunda ama aynı zamanda da çevresinde bu çok önemli sanat merkezinin onun yönetiminde pek çok çağdaş sanata da yer verdiğini de biliyoruz. Başka bir konuşmacımız Deepak Ananth, Hindistan doğumlu, çok önemli bir serbest küratör, dünyaca tanınan ve Anish Kapoor'un da sergilerinin küratörlüğünü yaptı geçmişte ve Fransa'da ve Londra'da pek çok büyük serginin küratörü ve sanat kritiği üniversitede ders veriyor. Profesör Martin Roth sadece bu toplantıya katılmak için Londra'dan geldi. Victorian Albert Müzesi Direktörü. Ve onun da görüşleri daha yakın zamanda çok çağdaş bir olaya sahne oldu Londra. Uzun kuyruklarla girilmekte zorlandı. Ve toplantımıza saat 4'te katılacağını yoğun programıyla bildiren Dr. Glenn Lowry, New York Modern Art Sanat Müzesi Direktörü. O da bizimle paylaşacak bütün bunları. Burada çok olmasını istediğimiz birisi vardı. Mikhail Piotrowski, St. Petersburg'daki Ermitaj'ın direktörü. Maalesef son anda başka bir önemli toplantı yüzünden iptal etmek zorunda kaldı gelişini. Ondan da dinleyeceklerimiz vardı muhakkak. Profesör Jarrige söylemedim. Profesör Jarrige, Fransız Akademisi üyesi, eski Gime Asya Sanatları Müzesi'nin direktörü ve bugün de Chantilly Condé Müzesi'nin direktörü, çağdaş sanatla yakın bir kişi. Efendim hoş geldiniz. Ben sözü bu büyük tartışmanın diyeyim, belki tartışılmayacak ama bu büyük bilgi paylaşımının moderatörlüğünü kabul eden Profesör Doktor Hasan Bülent Kahraman'a bırakıyorum. Onun da zaten çağdaş sanatın çok ortasında yer almış bir kişi. Art International'dan tutun bütün Türkiye'deki çağdaş sanat galerilerinin yakın dostu diyeyim, danışmanı, serbest danışmanı, fahri danışmanı, herkesin sorduğu bir kişi. Onunla hep birlikte olmaktan mutluyuz. Hoş geldiniz.
Efendim Nazan Hanım'a çok teşekkürler. En ağır yükü topu benim sırtıma yükledikten sonra sahneyi tabii her zamanki gibi kendi şarmıyla terk etti. Ben de o zaman kendilerine teşekkür ederek başlayayım. Bu imkanı yarattıkları için Sabancı Müzesi'ni en önemli sanatsal etkinliklerin yer aldığı İstanbul'u dünyada bir merkez haline getiren en önemli kurumlardan birisi haline dönüştürdüğü için kendisine teşekkür ediyoruz. Tabii böyle bir serginin düzenlenmesini sağlayan Yönetim Kurulu Başkanı Sayın Güler Sabancı'ya ayrıca teşekkür etmemiz gerekiyor. Onun vizyonu, yönlendirici gücü ile gerek bu müze, gerek bu sergi ve daha birçok şey İstanbul'da ve Türkiye'de büyük değer ve önem kazandı. Aynı şekilde bu serginin sponsorları olan Akbank Sanat ve onun Yönetim Kurulu Başkanı Sayın Suzan Sabancı Hanım'a da bu vesileyle teşekkür ediyoruz. Yine onların katkıları, destekleri, anlayışları olmasaydı bu kadar büyük, etkileyici, güçlü bir serginin İstanbul'da gerçekleşmesi çok zor olurdu. Açılışta belirtildiği gibi bu sergi nedeniyle bu müzede duvarlar yıkıldı. Binlerce, 10 binlerce tonluk işler vinçlerle indirildi, kaldırıldı. Bu vesileyle her şeyin ötesinde Sir Norman Rosenthal'e de ayrıca bu kürasyonun nedeniyle ben kişisel olarak kendi adıma, payıma teşekkür etmek isterim. Yine açılışta evet, teşekkür ederim. Bir alkış. Herkese tabii bütün bu adlarını saydıklarıma. Of course, you will have too many things to say. Right?
Before I look at this panel, there's something wrong, isn't there?
What's that?
All men. It's absolutely shocking, and I think Nazan should be forced to come onto this platform, at the very least to represent at least half of the world. Come on, Nazan. I mean, you've got to be, I mean, it's disgraceful. It's not acceptable.
Yeah, it's correct. I agree. Next time.
What?
Okay.
Sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
What do I press here?
We will have...
press something here to
No, you have to press this. All right. Just follow me. All right. Okay. Şimdi Nazan Hanım giriş konuşmasında zaten neyi tartışacağımızı aşağı yukarı belirtti. Biz de bu panelden önce kendi aramızda neyi nasıl konuşalım diye tartışırken bazı meselelerin üstünde durduk. Bu işin iki boyutu var muhtemelen. Birisi daha entelektüel bir boyut. O şu, çağdaş sanatçıların önemli bir bölümü bazen fark edilir bir biçimde, bazen fark edilmez bir biçimde klasik sanattan, klasik kültürden, arkeolojiden, geçmiş görsel birikimden önemli ölçüde yararlanıyor. Mapplethorpe'un fotoğraflarında doğrudan göndermeler olmasa bile klasik olanla çok yakın bir ilişkinin bulunduğu yazılan kitaplarda, yapılan çözümlemelerde ortaya çıktı. Picasso, çağdaş, bugünkü kullandığımız anlamda güncel bir sanatçı değildi. Oraya büyük bir açılım yapmış olmasına rağmen Velázquez'i defalarca resmetti. Birçok başka kendisinden önceki ressamla yüzleşti, hesaplaştı ve oradan belki bir çağdaşlaşma eğrisi oluşturmaya, parabolü, yayı oluşturmaya çalıştı. Bugün bu devam ediyor. Basquiat'ın resimlerinin arkasındaki klasik birikimden söz ediliyor. Basquiat'ın kendisinin Leonardo'yu gelmiş geçmiş en büyük sanatçı olarak kabul etmesinden söz ediliyor. Bu örnekler sınırsızca çoğaltılabilir. Kaldı ki sanat tarihi kesikli bir şey değil. Bugün hiçbir sanatçı kendisiyle başlamıyor. Her sanatçının kendi arkasında el aldığı, yararlandığı bir birikim var. Picasso'nun meşhur lafı var. Kötü sanatçı taklit eder, iyi sanatçı çalar diyordu. Dolayısıyla bu bilinen bir şey. Ama bu nasıl gelişiyor? Bugün ortaya çıkan boyutu bunun ne? Bu dediğim gibi yeni bir olgu değil. Daha önceki dönemde de bunu tanımlayacak, bu çerçeve içine girecek sanatçılar vardı. Bugün daha önemli olanı şu, çağdaş sanatın neredeyse bütün alanları işgal etmesi. Yine buraya gelmeden evvel yaptığımız toplantılarda çok büyük müzelerden birisinin yöneticisi, eğer programlarında çağdaş sanat sergileri, etkinlikleri yer almazsa devletten veya diğer kurumlardan herhangi bir katkı alamadıklarını söylediler. Bu başlı başına bir tartışma konusu. Ne oldu, ne bitti? Çağdaş sanat birdenbire dünyaya bu kadar yayıldı. Bu bir balon mudur, yoksa bunun arkasında daha derin bir gerçeklik var mıdır? Kuşkusuz vardır. Bu da başka, dediğim gibi, irdelemelerin konusu olarak ortaya çıkabilecek bir husus. Şimdi bugün bu panelde daha yumuşak bir biçimde, daha etkileşimli bir biçimde bu konuları ele alıp tartışacağız. Önce ben Norman Rosenthal'den başlamak istiyorum. Kendisi Royal Akademi'yi yıllar yılı yönetti. Daha sonra büyük sanatçılara, Schnabel'lara, Kapoor'lara ve başkalarına kitaplar yazdı, sergiler düzenledi. Dolayısıyla ona bu soruyu sorarak başlamak istiyorum ve sonra aynı soruyu diğer panelistlere yönelteceğim. Yöntem hakkında bir şey söyleyeyim. Bu bölümde herkesin işte 5-6 dakika konuşmasını rica edeceğim. 6'da bu toplantıyı bitireceğiz. Dolayısıyla saat 6'ya kadar geçecek olan süreyi bu şekilde eşit bir biçimde dağıtmış olacağız. Şimdi soru üstünde konuşacağımız soru şu. Evet, çağdaş sanatın, güncel sanatın, klasik mekanlarda, klasik kurumlarda, klasik sanatı öncelikle veya geçmişte ifade eden, öne çıkartan, gösteren, temsil eden kurumlarda yer alması ne ifade ediyor? Bunun boyutları nelerdir? Bu müzenin eski birikimine dönük bir şey midir? Yoksa o sanatçıya getirilen bir katkı mıdır? Bu sadece genel bir kültürel arayış, kültürler arası, metinler arası bir arayış mıdır? Yoksa bunun başka boyutları var mıdır? Evet, Norman Rosenthal'den başlayalım lütfen.
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose there are many answers to that rather complicated question. I think the most important thing, or one of the important things perhaps to reflect on, is that in the 20th century, it was in many ways an exceptional century. It was, in a way, the first century where modern art was somehow despised by the masses or by the large amount of people. It was the century where modern art became gradually more and more, inverted commas, elitist, more and more exclusive. Until that time, I would say, in human history, even going back, literally thousands of years, right down to the 18th 19th century, the thing that people were usually most interested in was, you know, the visual creativity of their own day and of their own time and their own place. So that the 20th century, in a funny kind of way, was a kind of exceptional period. Now, there are all sorts of complicated reasons for that. You know, that kind of funny revolution that took place, you know, with the Demoiselles d'Avignon and Cubism and modernism in generally, which suddenly, as it were, tried to resemble almost advanced physics. You know, tried to find a kind, you know, it sort of became impenetrable to those that were not really actively participating on a day-to-day basis with, you know, advanced science, advanced art. And so I think suddenly, towards the end of the 20th century, art life began to get back to kind of normal. And suddenly, I mean, I was, you know, involved in 1981 with an exhibition of the Royal Academy, which, if I can speak personally, if I'm allowed to talk about myself a little bit, and I hope I'm not bragging, it was an exhibition called A New Spirit in Painting. And a year later, I did a show in Berlin, which was called Zeitgeist. And at that time, when I was in the art world, you know, contemporary art was a very, very small, elitaire thing that took place. It was a male activity, first of all, largely. A white Western male activity. And it took place, you know, originally it was a kind of Parisian act. It was centered in Paris, and a little bit later, you know, in the 1940s, 50s, the center moved to New York, and so New York became the great center, which in my opinion it still is, for creativity, because it's, you know, art is a sort of city thing largely. It's not something that in general you know, the display, the discourse, the happening of art tends to take place in the great cities of the world. And in those days, the great cities of the world were the great Western cities of the world. So we're talking about New York especially, a little bit in Paris, a little bit in London, a little bit in certain Italian cities like Rome and Turin, and in Berlin a little bit, in Düsseldorf, you know, which at that time in the post-war period, Düsseldorf, Cologne, which was sort of coming up. But it was a tiny activity. There were two serious contemporary art galleries in London, the city which is where I grew up and I was young. And I remember in those days, you know, you would go to private views of artists, you know, now famous artists like Carl Andre, or for that matter, Anish Kapoor, the young Anish Kapoor as he was in those days. And there were perhaps 50 people at the opening. And if you weren't present at the opening, your friends would say, "Where were you?" Nowadays, of course, there are these massive openings, this kind of big, you know, the whole world of big biennales take place. Every city now has a biennale. Every city has an art fair. Art has turned into a kind of mega industry, and lots of people are participating. You know, many more people are participating in this contemporary art activity. That's on the one side of the equation. And on the other side of the equation is the development of museums, which is a relatively, again, if you look at it historically, a relatively recent thing. And this kind of sense of art history and the kind of conservatism that is kind of buried within museums naturally, because, you know, they're repositories of the past. And that somehow came to be seen by so many people, by a certain kind of establishment, as the only kind of valid art. The only kind of valid art was made in the past. And then suddenly, gradually, if I may say so, around the time that I did that show, and of course it wasn't just me, by any means, and of course it was many people, there was a kind of feeling that art was becoming more accessible, and gradually this kind of whole new industry of contemporary art opened up. And of course now we live in this kind of global village, which we weren't, you know, all those years ago. I mean, not so long ago, 30 years ago and more. And, you know, the world has changed, but the world in some ways has gone back to the old model, I would suggest, and I think that might be something worth discussing, but the old model with a terrific difference, because if you like, the paradigm of what I call art as being something that could only be appreciated, understood in a kind of narrow Western world has rather gone away. And suddenly, you know, the art discourse is taking place amongst young people all over the world, and older people all over the world of different sexes, of different sexual orientations, from different classes. And that, has obviously many, many good sides. It also has a slightly difficult side to it. And I think that difficult side is that the world has become at the one level so small, but at the other hand it's so big that it is impossible now to know everything. And that's one of the great problems of contemporary art, is that one doesn't know, it is impossible. I was speaking even to the director of the beautiful Istanbul Biennale, which I had a little preview of yesterday. I wasn't quite ready, but I had a very good feeling about it, and I hope that everybody in this room goes to see it, and I'm sure everybody in this room will probably go and see it. Unlike the Kapoor show, which is very heavy and strong, it's very full of quite fragile art, but very beautiful fragile art, and it has a very interesting, very homogeneous discourse. But she agreed with me, this curator, that it is impossible now to know everything and to know what's going on, so you can only deal with your own experiences and the things that you come across, if you like, in your own locality or in the places where you go to.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That was very lovely. And now I want to direct the same question to Dr. Thomas Lenz, who is the director of the Harvard University Museum. So the same thing, the contemporary art, the classical museums, classical sites, and the interactions.
I'm in an obviously different set of circumstances than Sir Norman. I'm the head of a...
Norman, please. Not
Norman.
Sir. No, I don't like the Sir
It's
stuff.
very kind of you, Norman. Thank you.
Let's stop that now.
I'm the director of an academic museum. We're attached to a very powerful university, Harvard University, and my task is essentially to create new kinds of teaching and learning experiences for students, for faculty, for the public, using our collections. And the bulk of our collections are historical in nature, and for a variety of reasons that I won't go into. We have, I would consider what I would call very significant gaps in terms of contemporary art in our collections. So we're in the process of building a new museum, in many ways fundamentally reorganizing our collections and how we present them to the public. And we very much want modern and contemporary art to play a much bigger role in this new museum, which has in many ways rested on its historical legacy and laurels. And one of the things I've been grappling with is a curatorial staff that is for the most part historically trained. And I'm a great believer in using contemporary art to essentially reframe older traditions, to, in a sense, shift the context and have people look at older traditions with new ideas, new eyes rather. And I'm a little bit surprised among my curatorial staff at a kind of backlash against contemporary art. I think there are a lot of reasons for that. Some of it is simply turf. Some of it is what they consider an encroachment on their materials into their gallery spaces. But one thing I've been grappling with during this time of rethinking the museum is wondering about what is so compelling about contemporary art in these new settings. And I think a lot of it has to do with, ultimately, why is it so compelling for contemporary artists to work with older materials, to put the old in juxtaposition to the new. And I'm tempted in a way to say that all of a sudden contemporary artists have all of a sudden looked at the human past as sort of the ultimate archive to be mined. And I think there are a lot of reasons why contemporary artists find, historical collections, whether it's archaeological remains or Renaissance art, why this is all of a sudden a new kind of material to play with. I think it's possible that there's a desire to make the old new, to transform it. I think there's also a desire to retranslate the old for contemporary audiences. I think we've also seen very clearly with this exhibition here at the Sabancı that although it's not explicitly stated here, but older traditions can feed and catalyze the artistic imagination. And I also sometimes wonder, although I don't think this is a well-trod path, that a number of contemporary artists actually believe that there are affinities between the contemporary world and the ancient world in terms of meanings and values and beliefs, although that's very much a shifting ground. But one thing I do firmly believe is that when contemporary artists use material remains from the past, for example, archaeological remains, they very clearly turn it into something else. Contemporary artists are not art historians, they're not archaeologists, and by all means, these older traditions are not neutral materials at all. They're anything but neutral. They're loaded with cultural values, cultural memories. So in a sense, archaeological remains, whether we're talking about Greek art or ancient Near Eastern art, they're a kind of new, exciting, very potent tool for a contemporary artist. But I think it's important to keep in mind that even when they step into this arena, we should never confuse what a contemporary artist does with archaeological remains as opposed to what an archaeologist does to it.
Thomas, thank you very much. He left at a very, very interesting point, and at this point I want to direct my question slightly transforming and changing to Professor Martin Roth. He is the director of the London Victoria and Albert Museum. And my question is, they had a very interesting show by David Bowie. All right, he is not an artist, I would say, like say Kapoor or someone else, but he comes from a different background, and the Victoria and Albert organized the show based on his work, himself, whatever it is and whatnot. So what was the meaning, what was the search behind that? Would you say that at the very same time, this is a very speculative part of the question, that show contributed to the reading, I would say, of David Bowie from that point on towards?
If you agree, 5 different topics, very brief. And Bowie's the last one, and we wrap it up. And I think we have to make our panel a little bit more exciting, so and a bit more fights going on. So I start probably with the most meanest way to talk about it is the contemporary art is just a marketplace. It's easy money.
He does what?
It's a marketplace, he says. Contemporary art is a marketplace. Come on. Easy money.
Easy money?
Yes.
What about old art?
I mean, Norman, give me the chance at least to. Okay. But we have a long history together, so. So with all the world changing, with the new world order starting 1988, 1989, there's a different approach to the arts, and that means it's also economy. I mean, think about the art market and how it developed in China. It's just amazing. I think we all were not prepared to it. And so I add to Norman's 2 points, and Norman, to come a bit closer to you, the 2 points that you mentioned were perfect. The development of contemporary, the artists, the museums, but on top of it, it's the market that drove it. Just give me a few minutes.
Always.
Sorry,
I won't send you until I last interruption, I promise.
That's the first topic. The second one, I think there was always mutual development, vice versa direction in art history. When Caspar David Friedrich came to Dresden in the 1830s, just to learn how to paint and to draw, and people didn't accept it. It was too modern. There were mean comments like took his paintings upside down and it still looked the same. So it was a different way to look at these paintings that we have today. We developed something completely different. Or talking about Dresden, something that I quote quite often because I really like it. You all know Gerhard Richter, great painter, but he doesn't like to talk so much. sometimes. And I remember that having that Caspar David Friedrich example in my mind, I asked him if he learned a lot growing up in Dresden. He learned a lot from the museums and collections in Dresden. And he said, no. So I said, but you've been quite often to the museums in Dresden. No. So I said, but you had a certain kind of inspiration from the city dedicated to the arts. I said, no. And after 5 minutes he came back to me and said, but when I went to the west of Germany, to Cologne and Düsseldorf, I was surprised that not all the cities have the same museums like we had in Dresden. What I mean, there was a kind of cultural mindset that influenced the whole city, that created a kind of spirit. And I think this dimension of contemporary art, new and old, tradition and new ideas, that's the inspiring part of it. It's not just contemporary, it's that tension that we created. Talking about the V&A, I mean, the V&A has a completely different history to other museums. It's pretty unique. The V&A, it's a long history, and I would like to tell you that long history, but I don't do it. It was a completely modern invention of the 1860s, Prince Albert, Henry Cole. It was democracy pure. It was the way to open the museum to everyone, knowing that the political, social situation were changing mid-19th century, a lot of revolutions going on in Europe, and you had to do something for the workers, for the masses, education, and definitely more. So what they started to create with the V&A was a museum that was a forum. Later they put the first gas lights in the gallery so they could come during the evening times after work. They had the first museums, restaurants there. It was really a forum for debates. And one of those, and I think that's extremely important, one of the brilliant ideas in the beginning was to collect art from all over the world to inspire designers and artists and craftsmen in London, in England, but in a global perspective. So Islamic art and Islamic tradition in the art was created a major impact of the development of the V&A in the 19th century and still today. And we have this Jamil Contemporary Art Prize. I think it's the first contemporary art prize given to Islamic art, and it's an amazing success, and I just want to mention it to you. Please Google it, look online, look at the V&A. It's too much to explain it to you, but it's really worth to follow it. The fourth point is, actually I want to add something because I like this topic of that tension between tradition and modernity. Right now we have a basilisk sculpture in the garden of the V&A, very impressive sculpture, the Three Graces. Well, actually it's untitled because we had a debate, or he had a debate about the title of that object, but it's somehow an adaptation, it's somehow a dialogue that he had with Canova's Three Graces, a sculpture that is in the V&A. So this tension between both, but he added more. His Three Graces somehow come from his little hometown in Saxony in East Germany, where he grew up, and he saw those three girls walking up and down the street, and you see that tension in the way he's talking about his youth, and that's the Third Reich. Anish Kapoor, talking about Anish Kapoor, when the V&A celebrated 150th anniversary, we published a book, and Anish Kapoor created a beautiful page how he started as a young student in London, and he went to the V&A and he saw those beautiful huge carpet coming from Iran originally, and inspired his artwork. So this kind of tension is something which it is, taken into consideration, talk about it. What happens to the world happens also to the museum. So if the museum is not reflecting what's going on outside, then the museum is lost. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have to deal with contemporary art. And if it's just as a dialogue or debate or forum or being prepared for a debate, so it's part of a contemporary development around the globe, and I think that's much more. It's also in terms of media and communication, that changed our world inside the museum as a reflection outside of the museum. Bowie experience. Now I keep that for another topic. Just another remark. We started with a new department a few months ago for architecture, urban development, digital design and design. And they started with what they call rapid collection program. And the first three objects that they, I mean, with the world outside and inside, the first three objects they collected is that, I'm sure you heard about that gun that someone in Texas invented, that you print out on a three-dimensional printer all around the globe. So this is one of those design objects that they had, collected for the V&A. Another one is jeans from that factory in Bangladesh that collapsed and killed a lot of people. And a third one, I'm a bit worried to mention it because we have a lot of debates about that in the museum. I think it's the first time that I talk about it in public. I'm sure you read last week or 2 weeks ago that The Guardian, the newspaper, had a problem talking about the situation with the US, to say it in a prudent way. And so the security force came to and destroyed the hard drive of a computer at The Guardian, which was really kind of scandal. So we asked The Guardian if we can have the hard drive for our museum. And we have that hard drive for our museum. Honestly, it's true and not true, because before it came to the V&A, it was taken to court. But I think the funniest discussion that we have right now is that, if it's in our archive, in the end it's in a state-owned archive, which is a kind of contradiction in itself. But anyhow, if you want to talk today about digital communication and the design of digital communication around the globe, you have to have something tangible. Sorry for that. But it's just invisible what we do normally in that field. So the hard drive is really an important object. Coming finally to Bowie. And Catherine Johnson is here in the audience. She was the co-curator for that exhibition, so it's much better if Catherine gives you that answer. Maybe if you want to talk to Catherine later. I think that success was not expected, not at all. We were somehow prepared for it. It would be a strange understatement if I say no. But it was the amount of visitors, but that's only one part of it. The other one was this kind of global audience. They came from everywhere, and also in a digital visits. And now the exhibition is traveling to Toronto next week, Sao Paulo in January, and goes on like that. Coming back to the essence of your question, I think it's much more today than just the art piece. It's about music. It's about pop music in this case. It's about fashion. It's about change in our society. I heard David Bowie the first time sitting in my Swabian South German village. Didn't understand why he looked like that, but I liked the music. And he said, be whoever you want to be. And that changed my life, till today. So I think that's that message, politics. But he referred to art history. He worked with one of his reference points was the Brücke collection, the Brücke Schule, and so on. So that overlaps. This kind of combination in a very positive sense, I think, made that exhibition so exciting. But, and I think that's the most important, at least learning experience for me, it's about our own life. It's about our time. It's not so much the reference to the past, it's that what happened during the last 40, 50 years. And that's definitely something that really, with all the political changes in society, is worth to show is undebated.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. Now, from now on, I would like to pick the point Martin made and left, and ask to Monsieur Jean-François Jarrige, who was the head of the Musée Guimet, and now who's running Musée du Chantilly, and both museums are more concentrated on the classical art. So, do you believe, in that sense, that a museum, a classical museum, should continue as it is without interfering much with the contemporary art? Is there a kind of possibility for any museum in the world, or should any museum this way or another should get involved in the contemporary art?
First of all, I must say that we have seen a tremendous change in the life of the museum life in France. Contemporary art was supposed to be the field of museum of modern and contemporary art, with the difficult question of modern and contemporary art. Other curators could go to Biennale to enjoy visiting galleries and contemporary art, but it did not indeed affect so much their own work. But the society has changed. Billionaire finance people, for instance, in France, people such as François Pinault, owners of Sotheby's, or Bernard Arnault, owners of LVMH, have contributed to promote living artists to an extent making ordinary people, as far as the financial aspects are concerned, rather amazed, and also to impress the financial world, which realized that there was a field for substantial amount of money and prestige. But artists fetching enormous price in auction sale are not so many, and in the case of living artists, I think Anish, Kapoor, Kiefer, or many the great art Richter or other great artists, for me they are no longer contemporary artists. They are still living, thanks God, but they are already part of art history. So in fact we have seen developing a strong pressure, because you have many galleries and people trying to promote their artists, and of course it's difficult to find prestigious location. So a museum, classical museum, are approached by such gallery or such people. If you display this artist, it's going to be helpful for us, of course, but we can support the cost of the exhibition and help you to show that your institution is no longer a dusty institution, but is part of the vibrant modernity. So it's very exciting for a curator, but the problem is many curators in classical museum lack the expertise and the proper knowledge. But sometimes it's thought for contemporary art, there's no problem. You see, if you have just a little knowledge of the general trends of contemporary art, it's enough. You can do that for Dutch painting, where you have to write. It is very wrong, because I think for contemporary art you need as much expertise than for the Dutch or Italian painting. But this is a feeling that you can organize very easily an event, not costly if you don't select, you see, the very famous artists, which are so famous that you almost need them, but they don't need you, so this is a different situation. And the problem is, after you see maybe 10 years, during which it was extremely important for a museum director to say that he would develop and promote contemporary art, which is a very respectable aim, and I think it's something important. Today, even in the ministries, we were told always to write in our report that we would do an event with contemporary art, but today it's today there is a tendency to be more cautious, because some museum, and I know an example of a director of a museum of Asian art, who decided, you see, to display contemporary art everywhere. And the result that the masterpieces of the collection were hidden by huge installations. So people came and were very furious. They, I want to see trying to look at masterpieces of the 15th century or 10th century. And so the result was that, yes, the number of visitors decreased so much that it was a museum run by the government, so the Ministry of Culture discharged the director. So I think, you see, the problem is, and I'm talking also of Museum of Asian Art, of dangerous tendency. For instance, myself, I was very fond of some Japanese or Chinese artists. One of them gave us a fabulous collection of traditional paintings, his own collection, and I said, oh, I would like to display your work, your personal work. Said, no, I don't want to be considered as to be in the ethnographic framework. I'm an international artist. I want to be in Beaubourg, in Grand Palais, but not in your Asian museum. But, and also the problem in France, we had so many exhibitions with installation which were not thought fitting very much the display of the collection, that some visitors believe, and myself too, that there was some work in progress. Say, good Lord, I wanted to see medieval art and I saw a lot of things, so probably some work is in progress. No, it's a contemporary exhibition. So I think what is extremely important, and I do believe that the dialogue between contemporary art and traditional art is something extremely interesting and extremely stimulating, but it's something very difficult. If an artist is able to produce something which is giving an added value to your classical collection, and if your classical collection is able to give an added value to the contemporary work, well, it's good. And that is happening quite often, but not always, and not so often. So this is really, for me, something extremely important, to be able to create something harmonious and not to display contemporary art just to tell people, you see, we are very modern, because ancient art is also very modern, medieval art is very modern. I mean, art of quality is always modern because it's out of time and it's a timeless creation. So working on this basis, I do believe that contemporary art and traditional art, it's something which could be very harmonious and which is already harmonious and which should be developed, but not to the extent of doing things which have not been properly planned and thought. That's my point.
Thank you very much. I will now turn the floor to Professor Claus-Peter Haase. He is the director of the ex-director of the Berlin Islamic Arts Museum, and his museum is a little bit different than the other museums. It's more concentrated on the Islamic arts. So how would you reflect on the same question regarding, your museum experience?
Evet, teşekkür.
Evet.
Hoş geldiniz. I would like to take up the file of my dear pre-locutors. This is a very important question. I'm now, of course, under the stereo impression coming from Berlin with a big Anish Kapoor exhibition in a very special place. It's an exposition hall. And now seeing equally heavy Anish Kapoor works in quite a different sort of museum. The Sabange Museum has meanwhile become something of a universal museum, not by its collection, but by its exhibitions over the 10 years. So now you have a file from archaeology to contemporary artists working at the exhibitions here within one museum, and this is an extraordinary occasion. In Berlin, the national museums, 16 of them, are somehow dispersed over the town, and the Museum of Islamic Art, as you said, is a very special museum with 50,000 objects, which is not a small one, but it's housed on the upper floor of the Pergamon Museum. So imagine on my first working day at the museum, the stair flight was a little boy, no, not a little, a middle-aged boy running down the stair flights and said, "Oh, up there, that's all Islamic, I don't want that." This was the welcome for the new director, and I had to consider what to do to bring in such youngsters, unwilling youngsters, into the museum, because of course this museum should stay on, and I fear one would have to address them in a different language than what was used until then. So we started with grasping occasions. One of the occasions was, of course, the American intervention in the Iraq war. And in 2003, I was looking for an Iraqi artist. There were many around. The famous Baghdad School of Sculptors, many of them trained by East German artists, was very well known. It was inaccessible at that time, of course. So I asked around. There were many artists living abroad as refugees, and I found one who did not, as the first, paint an American helicopter or address something intentional for the moment being, but who grasped a deeper subject, the flight and the future disaster coming to the Iraqi people. It was one living in Holland, and he did a wonderful, very intimate show from the staircase up to the collection. He did not want to enter with his work in the collection. Later on, we had Iranian and also Turkish artists. Turkish design as a critical art was very impressive and had a great auditory. I noticed somehow there were dribbling in some more youngsters, some more exotic figures. You even saw veiled Turkish ladies arriving. This had not happened before. You can imagine. Museum of Islamic Art is a dangerous thing. You never know, is that the right Islam which is represented there, or is it just something historical? Or isn't that all stolen objects? That's another subject I don't want to tackle now. The idea was that we need to have a contemporary question in the art. Now, as Jean-François Jarrige said, all art has been contemporary. Nanucci quotation, I think. This is very easy to make somehow a sign, or to give a sign. These objects which you could observe here in the historical collection have a lot in common with that what modern and contemporary artists are producing. One could be didactic about it, and I tried to convince some artists to put their works for a certain period, a month or so, into the historical collection. This was very difficult. The best answer to all this was given by Heinz Mack, one of the Zero artists in Germany, less known abroad, but of a very vigorous temperament, you know, a German artist bringing the light into the Orient. He was the first to do a pyromanic show in the Algerian desert in the 60s, and appeared as an astronaut when we didn't talk yet of astronautic vests. But I tried to get him to do something similar, pyromanic, not in the museum, but maybe in the courtyard. Then he had a long visit to the historical collection in the museum, and he said, no, this is impossible. The historical works are too strong. They are so overwhelming. I cannot put my objects, my inventions, in vicinity to them. Please, couldn't you arrange that they all disappear somehow, at least for the opening? Well, we had expected the opening would not be possible within the Islamic rooms, so we had a wing emptied at that period by other reasons, and the opening ceremony was in the large Pergamon hall, and some light artist had given a blue light on the floor, which made all the Pergamon altar disappear. It was all in a blue cloud, and Mack alone appearing in a sort of pyromanic vest was the king of the evening. It was attractive in a way as installation of himself, and the works he was showing were his historical work on light effects with some reflections on the main arguments and the main topics of Islamic art, ornament and its deeper meaning. The catalogue was a wonderful work by him and some of his friends, introducing historical subjects via the view of a modern German artist. Artists, as you know, have a peculiar way of looking into problems, and they notice problems earlier. It's just the question that you find the artist who is tackling a problem which you can show in your museum, in your surroundings, in your collection, and that you find an artist who is attracting the new public, not that public which always arrives at your museum, but the one who would not have entered the museum before, because they were afraid of the historical objects. They were afraid of being overwhelmed by new information. You don't want to read all this on the Islamic religion, on Islamic culture. You want to see something which is influencing your thoughts and your aesthetics. And this is, of course, transmitted perhaps by a contemporary artist. The best success was the Iranian show by 6 Iranian artists from Iran and from abroad, because it was a major catastrophe for the diplomatic courses in Berlin and circles in Berlin, and there was some newspaper rumor about it. So perhaps one needs to do something rather heavy, like Anish Kapoor, to make an impression on a new public. The new public, we have seen it yesterday in the discussion when Anish Kapoor was giving his long lecture in front of 200 persons, 90% of them young people from Istanbul, from the surroundings here, and I think this was a very impressive moment for the Sabancı Museum, also for me. It would have been hardly possible in Berlin, but that is other reasons.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now I am going to give the ground to Deepak Ananth, who is a freelance art critic and an art curator who has created shows by Anish Kapoor previously. And he's going now to talk about this matter regarding, dealing with a contemporary artist, or the other contemporary artists in general.
Yes, thank you. I just want to correct one error. I worked very closely with Anish on his first major exhibition, which in France, which was at the CAPC Museum in Bordeaux, but not others. But of course, I have other projects with him. But in fact, when I was asked to participate in this discussion, and we were also, I think all of us, asked to give a title, I titled the sort of notes I've taken, or reflections, if you will, as Only Connect, with the question mark, and with contemporary art in a classical frame, with contemporary and the word classical both in inverted commas. So what I wish to suggest right at the outset is, and I agree with what Jean-François Jarrige said earlier on, that the term contemporary is as sort of slippery or mutable as the word classical, and I'm using classical really as shorthand to denote, let's say, works which are in the museum from the past. And therefore, and of course, the idea of only connect comes from E.M. Foster, and it's a way of suggesting that the coexistence or cohabitation of contemporary art with art from the past is always stimulating and interesting, but of course it's not always successful. But in fact, what I wanted to do is to bring up certain key moments in this discourse about this problem, which touch upon the idea of museums, of course, and not just about what museums show in their collections. And just to sort of historicize the problem, I'm glad that Dr. Roth, for example, mentioned Friedrich, because I think the whole problematic of artists themselves looking to the museum as a new kind of subject matter, so to speak, begins precisely in the 1860s with Manet. As Michel Foucault says somewhere, Manet is the first artist to produce art self-consciously in relation to the museum. just as, for example, Flaubert Flaubert is in relation to the library, what Manet is in relation to the museum. So I'm just saying that this whole self-consciousness about the artist, and of course we shouldn't forget that Manet was obviously contemporary when he was painting, but looking, I mean, his relation to the Louvre and to Raphael or to Giorgione, or when you look at Olympia or the Déjeuner sur l'herbe, they are sort of a mosaic of quotations, and this is the first time in the history of art where you have this self-conscious relation with the past. And I think that does reflect on the fact that how, from that time onwards, in very different ways, museums, artists, and the relation between artists, or the artist was contemporary with the museums in question, has always been, I think, a question of a dialogue. I mean, the contemporary and the classical, another way of glossing this would be to say it's the relationship between tradition and modernity, or what was also called in the past la querelle des anciens des modernes, the quarrel between the ancients and the moderns. So I think that kind of dialogue or dialectic or even disjunction between institutions and artists has always existed, but that's sort of obviously accelerated over the last few decades. But it's an old problem, and I think parallel to this, let's say, I've quoted Manet, there are also people who have thought about what a museum which is sort of capacious enough to accommodate all kinds of works of art from everywhere. And I think that there's a lead which comes from Malraux and his idea about the Musée Imaginaire, which in English very conveniently, is transposed as a museum without walls. And of course, for Manet, the key criteria for, let us say, including frescoes, miniature painting, staining glass, but also a head from Gandhara or Sumerian statue, is precisely that they can all be photographed and they all form images in this vast archive, which is no longer a museum, obviously, but a book. But I think that idea was already is a stimulus for thinking about how works from different epochs or periods or styles can jostle or be can coexist, and I think that idea has filtered down somewhere to our times. I mean, there are lots of other models as well. I mean, I want to suggest in passing, for example, someone like A.B. Warburg, who proposes with his Mnemosyne or Atlas, a very extraordinary new way of an iconological way of reading images, where again it's a question of juxtaposing images from the most disparate periods, etc. So what I want to suggest, I wanted to just sort of highlight certain key moments where this dialogue, where all this starts, where the museum self-consciously becomes a kind of archive for the artist. And of course, I mean, much later on, you have contemporary artists who mime, either ironically or in a spirit of parody, some of the sort of protocols of display that they find in museums. For example, I can think, there are many examples, but I can think of the French artist Christian Boltanski, who initially, for example, uses museum vitrines to put the most sort of ordinary, banal objects. So he's obviously miming the kind of sort of displays of ancient relics, but of course what he's showing are basically sort of relics of his everyday life. I mean, that's just one example among many others. You have an artist like the Belgian artist called Marcel Brotaars, who proposes a whole sort of poetic, personal mythology about the museum. He creates a museum which is called the Department of Eagles, etc. I don't have time to go into what he does, but I'm just saying that from the 70s onwards, there is this tendency among many artists to sort of enter into a relationship with the museum, which is in a way parodying or even sort of paying homage to the notion of the museum, the display, the archive. But we also have an artist, for example, from the late 50s onwards, like a great artist called Robert Rauschenberg, who in his own work, for example, juxtaposes images of Velázquez with, for example, a flight into space. So this whole idea, I think, about juxtaposing images which really don't have any connection between them, but which which acquire a relation because of the way the artist has sort of configured them, I think goes also is in a way a reflection on a tendency which will become widespread later on when museums also invite artists to sort of intervene in their collections, or they juxtapose works which is very contemporary with works of the past. I just have one other thing to say, which is, perhaps I'll come back to it later. But so, I mean, I thought it would be interesting, for me at least, to pinpoint some of these precedents which make for this exchange, which is now obviously very much more widespread.
Thank you very much. I believe this was a very exciting round. Now we will take a break for 15 minutes and then we will continue. Our great friend Glenn Lowry is together with us, and we will start by him and listening to his comments on the matter, and then we will continue. Thank you very much for your interest.